Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we're going to be looking at a phenomenon that is occurring on YouTube and different internet sources, and that is the so-called moon hoax conspiracy theory. And if you spend any time on the internet, you'll run into this from time to time. It is the belief that the United States in 1969 never really did go to the moon, and that it was all staged in Hollywood, and the U.S. government, particularly NASA, has perpetrated a hoax for all these long years because they didn't really have the technology to do it, so they had to figure out a way to make the public feel that we did, in fact, land on the moon. We were the first people to the moon, and that we beat the Soviet Union. And so we had to stage the hoax of the moon landing. That's the theory. That's the conspiracy theory, the moon landing conspiracy theory hoax. And what I want to do today is talk about this and show you that if you really look at the facts, if you really look at all of the evidence, we did, in fact, go to the moon. We did go to the moon. The United States landed men on the moon in the Apollo program, and there's no way that you can contradict those facts. And if you look at all of the facts, you look at all of the information, not just take little pieces isolated from each other. If you go through all of the photographs and you go through all of the video, all of the so-called conspiracy snapshots that supposedly show something like a light in the background that could have been a stage light, they say. Or you look at all of the different things related to the moonshot pictures and video. If you go through them carefully, you will find out that none of these so-called incidences can't be explained. They all can be explained. It's called over-analysis. If you try to over-analyze something, analyze something, what will happen is that you will begin to read into that something more than is there. You're overdoing your analysis. You're looking too closely at a picture. Now, you'd say, well, if you look really close, you'll find something wrong with it. That's right. If you look at anything, it's like, for example, a government investigation. Let's say the government wants to open up an investigation on some random politician. If you research something enough, you are going to raise questions. You are going to raise suspicion about this person. They could be the saint of saints. They could be the Mother Teresa of Mother Teresas. Yet if you investigate someone close enough, you can overanalyze her life, Mother Teresa's life, to the point where you begin to raise questions about her ethics, her morality, her holiness. And it's solely because you are looking and staring at one thing too much and you're reading too much into it, or you're raising questions that you don't have enough data to answer. But by virtue of raising the question, you are casting doubts. And that's what people are doing with the moon landing. There is so much data out there, so many pictures, so many video, so many audio recordings, so much data, evidence that we did in fact land on the moon, that the only way you can come up with this conspiracy theory is that if you overanalyze any one piece of evidence to the point where you are uncovering things that are so trivial and you're trying to cast doubt on something, that yes, you can find things that seemingly don't explain themselves. And when you do that, you say, aha, see, this is proof that it's a hoax. And it's not really proof that it's a hoax at all. It's just simply meaning that you have found something in a photograph that you don't understand, or you have found something in a video or audio recording that you can't find an explanation for, or the ones that are explaining it you don't want to buy into or you don't believe or whatever, and so you're saying, aha, this is proof. And so you can overanalyze anything, and that's what happens to these lunar landing conspiracy theorists. They are overanalyzing things. And it also comes back to the point where they doubt that human beings are smart enough or capable of pulling off something as grand as a moon landing. There are a lot of people that go, it's just impossible for a man to be on the moon. It's just no way. That could not have happened. That takes too much ingenuity, too much smarts, too much technology, too much brain power. There's no way that man could have done that. Just little old man on the planet Earth, there's no way that he could leave our planet and actually walk on some other heavenly body. There's no way that man could have done that. They just find it hard to believe that people could figure out how to get off this planet and actually land on another body in space, and called the moon. And so they go, no, that's just a hoax. But I want to read to you something in the book of Genesis from the 11th chapter that shows you from the Bible that it is possible for men to do, and men and women, the human race, to do things that are seemingly impossible. And I'm going to the story of the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was this gigantic structure that was constructed by people in primitive time. And it says here something that's very curious. So let me read this, and then I'll talk about it. In verse 1 of chapter 11, it says, "Now the whole world was one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, 'Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly.' They used bricks instead of stone, and tar for mortar. And then they said, 'Come, let us build for ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to heavens, so they may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth.' But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, 'If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other.' So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth." So here is an example of men getting together and organizing to do something big. And it says, "And the Lord said, if the people speaking one language, they begin to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them." Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. So here we have, right in Scripture, we have in the Bible a teaching that says that the human race, men and women, when they get together and put their mind to something, they can do nearly the impossible. And says, in fact, it says there in the Bible that if they get together and put their mind to do something and they speak one common language, then nothing they plan will be impossible. So that is giving us a clue as to how we could have figured out how to get to the moon. Now, it is one of the greatest cultural and scientific and humanistic achievements of all time. When you get people together, working together, and that's what happened at that time. You had a president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, lay down a challenge of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth before the end of the 60s. Okay, so there was the goal. There was the challenge. And, people love challenges, especially people involved in technology and invention. They love challenges. Now, people love challenges, but they usually don't have the money to do it. Even if they have the idea and the will and the motivation, they usually don't have the resources to pull something off on a grand scale. But in this instance, when Kennedy laid down the challenge, and NASA and the U.S. government got behind it, they provided the resources for the scientists and the engineers to actually start and accomplish this task. So you usually would not have a combination of a challenge and a goal and the skilled intelligence and know-how to pull it off and the resources at the same time to do it. But we did. And we also had motivation to beat the Russians to the moon, because the Americans, they didn't want to look up at the moon and realize that there was a Russian flag up there and that Russia had claimed the moon for its own, because they didn't want that to happen. So they wanted to be able to go there, first of all, and create a neutral moon, so that when we all look up at the moon, we're not going to see red, Kremlin, communist red. We're going to see a gigantic body in the sky that is peacefully claimed for all mankind. And that's what Neil Armstrong did when he stepped off the landing pad, when he said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." He claimed it for everyone, not just the U.S., not just for English-speaking people. He claimed it for humanity, for mankind, for the whole world. So that was another motivating factor. But you have the Bible teaching that there is great power in unity. And there's great power when men come together, men and women, humanity, mankind, comes together for the purpose and goals that they set. It says here, if they work together, then nothing will be impossible for them. Now, why is that? Why is it that God has so much respect for the ability of mankind, to accomplish things on this earth? Well, because he put that ability within man. He created man and woman in the image of God. So humanity is created in the image of God. We share many of the characteristics of God Almighty. Of course, we're not infinite, we're not omnipresent and omnipotent, we're limited, we're finite. We're not at all like God in his infinite attributes, but we are like God in the sense that we have many of the same characteristics. We have intelligence, although not nearly and in any way close to God in that area, but we do have intelligence, which separates us vastly from the animals. We also have the willpower, and we have vision, and we have self-recognition and consciousness and all kinds of other things that God also has. So we are made in the image of God. Some people have referred it, we're a spark off the divine being. In one sense, that's true. We're fallen, though. That's the other factor. We're fallen. We've fallen into sin. We are part of a fallen race. So that's the negative part of it. And so why God came down to confuse the people of Babel, not because they were exercising their abilities and gifts and talents that God had given them, but they were doing so for self-centered reasons. They were doing things in a rebellious way. It says the tower wanted to reach up into heaven. In other words, they wanted to become like God. They wanted to take a higher place than God had put them. They wanted to reach up into heaven, and you might even surmise from the description, they wanted to assault heaven. They wanted to attack heaven. They wanted to challenge God. They wanted to pretend they were God. And so God said, no, I'm going to scatter their languages and scatter these people so that they don't accomplish what they would have accomplished if they had tried to build this tower. In other words, they would have built a glorious structure, and it would have been one of the wonders of the world. But he wanted to put an end to that. Now, as far as the space race, God permitted that. And he may have permitted that for a number of different reasons. We don't understand all of the reasons why God allowed that to happen. But if you look at the evidence, if you look at the video, the pictures, the audio transmissions, if you investigate the whole history of the space launch and the Apollo program, you will realize that it's not a hoax. It's actually a reality. We went to the moon. We exercised our gifts and talents as humans. We had sufficient funding from the government. The government spent billions and billions of dollars on this project and took the best scientists and got them working on it. We had one of the actual original rocket geniuses, Wernher von Braun, and he was not a mathematical, but a rocket genius, and he could design and plan out how to get men out of Earth's orbit and all kinds of things that really helped us. So we were able to capitalize on the genius ability of some men, the engineering ability of a lot more, and we were able to dip into the funding of the United States government in the tune of billions of dollars. And so when you take all of that together and you also put a huge challenge by President Kennedy, you get a formula for success. And we did succeed in going to the moon. Now, when you think about it upon reflection and you look up at the moon, that bright light in the night, and you look at it and you go, did men really go there? Did we really blast off the planet Earth and actually send a rocket to the moon and land and walk around on the moon? And do we actually then take off from the moon and come back to Earth? And did we pick up moon rocks on the Earth? And do we really do that? Because it really seems to be hard to believe that we could have done that. And it is actually very difficult to believe without a context, because it's like, how can you go to the moon? How can you get off this planet? How can you do these amazing things? And for a lot of people, it's just so incredible to think that we could have done something like that, that they actually buy into the moon hoax. And the moon hoax plays off on the fears of incredulity. It plays off on the fears of that's impossible, and sort of a natural skepticism that we might have in believing things that are so hard to believe, naturally speaking. But you have to go back to the fact that God created humanity in his image. He put within him intelligence. He put within him the ability to learn and grow. He put within him the ability to problem solve. And basically the moonshot was a whole long series of problem solving challenges, ranging on small to huge to nearly impossible. And by the grace of God and a lot of hard work and perseverance, people came together for this project and were able to solve every single one of the problems that was presented to them to create the means by which we could achieve the goal that President Kennedy laid out for our nation, which is to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth. And we did that in the last year of the 60s, the decade. So we made the goal. And it was amazing that we were able to make the goal, let alone do it, but to actually do it within the time frame. But that time frame helped us achieve the goal, because if he had left that open-ended, if he had said, I challenge you to land a man on the moon and bring him safely to the Earth, well, you might say, okay, well, let's start working toward that. And, maybe 20, 30 years from now, we'll achieve that. But he actually set a deadline before the end of the decade. And that deadline was very ambitious. In fact, there were many, many scientists and engineers and administrators that felt that that was an impossible goal, and that would not be met. We would not come anywhere close to meeting that. And yet, they began planning, they began pursuing the goal, and sure enough, we were able to meet that challenge. Now, one of the things that helped us, push us to meet the challenge, was that we had some intelligence reports, some data, some information coming from the Soviet Union that they were about ready to launch a man to the moon. So we thought that they might be ahead of us, that they might actually beat us. So we had to step up the pace, and that's what happened. NASA actually stepped up the program. There were some other tests that needed to be done, and there were some other stages in the planning that needed to take place before we actually sent men to the moon to orbit the moon and then come back. But that was rushed and pushed ahead and said, no, we're going to go and orbit the moon first, and then in a later mission we're going to actually land on the moon. So the whole program was sped up because of the threat that the Russians might actually beat us to the moon. Now, as it turned out, the Russians were not able to come anywhere close to landing someone on the moon, but we didn't know that. And so we were operating on an assumption that they were very close, and so we had to keep pressing and pressing. And that pressure helped focus people and challenge people to work harder and work faster and solve these problems. And in the end, it actually turned out to be the case that that bit of information that was actually not true helped push us to achieve the goal before and into the 60s that Kennedy has laid out. So things converged at the right time to make the moon landing possible. Now, some conspiracy theories say that if we actually did go to the moon in the late 60s and early 70s, then why haven't we been back there since? Why has it been nearly 50 years since we actually sent men to the moon? If this actually happened, you would think that we would be sending men to the moon all the time, and that we would have had a colony by now. And why did all of a sudden the moon program stop abruptly? And that just happens to be a coincidence of history where we started sending men to the moon pretty frequently and pretty quickly. After the first man landed on the moon and walked on the moon, we started sending men in rapid succession to the moon. And if you recall, in the early 70s, we were sending men to the moon like every 6 months or so. So it was busy time. But unfortunately, the goal had been met. And again, this shows you the power of human nature and the goal. We achieved the goal. We beat the Russians to the moon. And it was like, okay, now what? And believe it or not, people at the time began to complain that we were spending way too much money and too much attention on the moon when we were dealing with all kinds of problems here in the United States. The Vietnam War was going on still. There was tension, political tension, assassinations. It's just a lot of stuff going on, and a lot of people lost interest in the challenge because we'd already met the challenge of going to the moon. And so there was pressure to cut funding. The Apollo program was basically shelved, and we didn't go back to the moon. Now, after a number of decades had passed and we were doing other things like the space shuttle and all kinds of space station and orbiting the Earth and all kinds of other things and goals, less expensive and so forth, then if you come back like 50 years later and say, well, why don't we just use all the same technology we used back then? Why don't we just copy it? Well, the problem with that is we used the very best technology available back then. So if we were to totally create, for example, a Saturn V rocket with all the older technology that we used back then, a lot of that stuff is obsolete. A lot of the commercial industries that created those parts no longer exist. So we'd have to handcraft every part of a Saturn V rocket, and all the other parts that were contracted out. And these companies don't create those anymore. So they have to be all custom built, which would be an astronomical cost. So really the only solution is you have to redesign the whole thing. You have to come up with new technology. Now that's what's happening right now with SpaceX and and all of the other private companies. They are taking up the challenge of taking the basic technology that is still available and then redesigning all of the rockets and capsules and systems in order to return to the moon or even go further, go to Mars. So if you look into these so-called moon conspiracy theories, what you're going to find is that these guys like to raise a lot of questions and then pretend there are no answers. But if you look deeper, there really are answers, and that the scientists and engineers have answered these questions. But the conspiracy theory hoax people want to continue to raise the same questions even if they've been answered. And they think that because they raise the questions, that's legitimate. But you have to listen to the answers, and you have to think about the answers that the engineers are saying. And if you think about them long enough, you realize, oh yeah, that makes sense. And it also, the questions that the conspiracy theorists are saying doesn't make sense in light of all that we know. And so don't be alarmed when you read or hear or see moon hoax conspiracy theories floating around the internet or on YouTube, or people at work talking about them. Look into it yourself and realize that yes, indeed, we did go to the moon. We are capable of figuring out how to do it because God created within us gifts, talents, abilities, because we're created in the image of God. And even though it's an amazing thing to think about man landing on the moon, it's not impossible because of the potential that God has created within each person. Now, I challenge you to not only use the potential God has given you, but to commit your life to God, because that's most important in life. It's more important to commit your life to God than for man to go to the moon, because eternity is more valuable than just a temporary victory of achievement of going to the moon. So what's most important for mankind is not going to the moon, it's to getting to know God through Jesus Christ. So if you've never committed your life to Jesus Christ, I strongly encourage you to do that today. Don't waste any more time. You are created in the image of God, in the likeness of God. Don't squander that gift. Don't waste it. And don't end up separated from God for all eternity because you failed to commit your life to Him. So God bless. We'll see you again on another edition of Christ in Culture. God bless.